senior people in reform are starting to think the unthinkable, and they're starting to think about life beyond Nigel Farage and whether or not sooner rather than later reform are going to have to move on from Nigel Farage, precisely because of the issues and the story that you've been just been detailing. There's been a growing feeling of concern within the party that these various sort of financial scandals.
Interesting intervention from Rupert Lowe today. Rupert Lowe, as you remember, used to be part of Reform. He was a Reform MP. He had a big stushy with Nigel Farage, and he left. He set up his own party called Restore UK, and actually Restore UK have been doing quite well in some of these by-elections. In fact, people are sort of arguing that they're kind of eating into the vote that Reform used to get. He went on X this morning and made an interesting intervention. Let's have a listen to what he had to say.
So Nigel, my message is simple. If you are prepared to work together around serious policies, serious reform and serious government, then so are we. Not because it's politically convenient for Restore Britain, not because it's personally easy. After the events of the last 18 months, I would certainly rather not be making this offer. But millions and millions of British people deserve a patriotic government that puts our national interest before any personal differences that you and I may have.
Right, there's a lot to unpick there. Now delighted to be joined by Dan Hodges, who is a columnist for the Daily Mail and has got a really interesting column in today's Mail on Sunday, where he has been talking to a lot of Reform insiders. Dan, thanks very much for joining us. Good afternoon.
Afternoon.
So what have you been finding out, speaking to people within Reform? How is the sort of faith within Reform at the moment?
Well, as I sort of report today, for the very first time, senior people in Reform are starting to think the unthinkable, and they're starting to think about life beyond Nigel Farage and whether or not sooner rather than later Reform are going to have to move on from Nigel Farage, precisely because of the issues and the story that you've been just been detailing. There's been a growing feeling of concern within the party that these various sort of financial scandals, obviously the staggering £5 million donation he got from Harborne, the relationship with George Cottrell, a man who was convicted in the States of wire fraud, the constant questions around various murky elements of Reform's internal funding, that these just aren't going away, and worse than simply not going away, they are now starting to cut through, and we can see that in the opinion polls. Reform's sort of national opinion poll rating and Nigel Farage's own personal approval ratings are frankly going down in flames at the moment, and that is something of now of real concern to a number of senior people within the party.
And one of the things that I thought was really interesting in your piece was how the decision was made about Nigel Farage resigning and triggering this by-election. I mean, it feels like many in the party think that has now backfired, and that was a bit of a misstep on his part.
Well, I mean, within Reform, it's not just a feeling. There's now a general acceptance that was a disastrous move by Nigel Farage for a number of reasons. I mean, firstly, the nature of how the decision was taken. A number of senior figures within Reform simply just weren't aware of what he was planning. The decision was taken by himself and a very small sort of clique of people around him. Obviously, we then had, the supposed masterstroke, which it was supposed to be him standing up to the establishment. I mean, that fell apart within a few hours because obviously they then realised it was going to be Nigel Farage simply, trying to defend himself against a man with a bin on his head. And obviously, as we've seen over the last few weeks, this is consuming so much effort from Nigel Farage, from Reform, during the summer recess at a time when they traditionally capitalise and seize the media agenda. Instead, we've seen, Andy Burnham obviously going up in the polls, the Burnham bounce. We've seen the Tories, Chris Phelp, actually, exploiting the small boats issue. And that has, again, sort of added to the concerns. But I think the fundamental fact is, again, the feeling inside Reform is this issue is not going away. The 5 million donation issue is not going away. The whole Farage gamble, this whole sort of farce we're seeing in Clacton at the moment, was for a single purpose. It was supposed to be to draw a line under all this. And as everybody can see, it isn't. If anything, it's given the whole issue more saliency.
And many people have made the argument that Reform doesn't really work without Nigel Farage because he is such a towering figure. I mean, he's been arguably the most consequential politician of our generation. Do you agree with that? If he were to go, first of all, do you think there's any chance he could either walk or be toppled? And if that did happen, who could lead Reform? Would Reform still be an electoral force without Nigel Farage?
Well, a number of things. I mean, firstly, yes, I do think now there is a possibility, and I think an increasingly strong possibility, that at some point in the next few months, Nigel Farage will choose to walk away. And if he doesn't, then some internal sort of divisions, the internal divisions are frankly just going to burst out into the open, I think. I'm not one of the people, and I say that in my comment today, I'm not one of those people who believes in there is no life for Reform beyond Nigel Farage, simply because obviously Reform are doing poorly in the polls at the moment. They've had a succession of poor election results, setting aside the May local elections, which were effectively just a referendum on Keir Starmer. But they're still at 20% in the polls. They're an established political force. They represent a strand of British public opinion, which is, a strand of opinion which is strongly embedded in a small minority of the British electorate. So the idea, which I think is a bit of wishful thinking from some of Reform's opponents, that if we can just get rid of Farage, Reform go away, I don't see that. And obviously you have in Jenrick, in Tice, in Lee Anderson, you have some sort of well-known, sort of high-profile political figures. So I, as I say, I'm not one of these people who think it's Farage or bust for Reform.
Could you see someone like Zia Youssef leading the party?
Not Zia Youssef. Zia Youssef is a very, very divisive figure within Reform. Zia Youssef's the only reason Zia Youssef, in a sense, is still a part of the Reform project is because Nigel Farage is personally sort of protecting him. There's a lot of anger and animosity within Reform directed towards Zia Youssef. So I think if Nigel Farage were to go, then it wouldn't be long before Zia Youssef was out the door after him.
And what do you make of this intervention by Rupert Lowe today? Do you think there's any chance of a sort of union between Restore and Reform?
I mean, I personally don't, because the animosity and the personal animosity between Rupert Lowe and Nigel Farage is so great. I don't think Nigel Farage, for one, would countenance any sort of agreement. I think what's happening here is, obviously, we've just had the Manchester mayor election. Obviously, a lot of focus on what was a very good win for Labour. But sitting beneath the figures, Restore, quite incredibly, if you think about it, secured 8% in the first ballot, and actually came above the Tories. Now, for a party of their standing, that was an incredible result, and follows on from the result that we saw in Makerfield, where again I think they secured between around 8 or 9% of the vote. What you're seeing is, frankly, is Rupert Lowe basically exploiting Nigel Farage's weakness, exploiting Reform's weakness, and exploiting Reform's fall in the polls and the growing division on the right of British politics. As I said, I don't think anything will come of this, but again, it just emphasises what a weak and vulnerable political position Nigel Farage is now in.
And one of our listeners, Neil, has messaged in saying, is there any chance that Reform and the Conservatives could align in any way to try and block a kind of, if this Andy Burnham bounce continues? Do you think there's any possibility of that?
No, I mean, again, the hatred between politicians in Reform and politicians in the Conservative Party actually exceeds their hatred for their opponents on other areas of the political spectrum. And also Kemi Badenoch, I mean, has just completely ruled it out. I mean, the mood amongst Kemi Badenoch's mood, the mood amongst Kemi Badenoch's team is basically she is now in a position where she can just discount out of hand any deal with Reform. Their view is it's now only a matter of time before we get what they call crossover, before Kemi Badenoch and the Tories. I mean, Kemi Badenoch's personal ratings are already well above Nigel Farage's. They think it's only a matter of months before the Tories finally
start making some recover
to the point they're above Reform. So frankly, the mood amongst Kemi Badenoch's team is we don't need to do a deal with Reform now.
Okay, right. Two questions before I let you go, Dan. Quite a lot of our listeners are messaging in saying, basically, and lots of listeners messaging in, basically saying, you and Dan and others and all journalists are just bullying Nigel Farage. It is an absolute disgrace that people are focusing on his private finances. This is all terrible sort of media conspiracy. Lots of people are complaining about the Times. You obviously don't work for the Times, you work for the Mail Group. What would you say to those listeners who seem to be feeling that Nigel is a victim here of a kind of bad, nasty press?
Well, up to I can only speak for myself. Up to a few weeks ago, I was getting told exactly the same thing about how I was treating Keir Starmer. Before that,
me too, Dan. Me too.
Exactly the same criticism about how I was treating Rishi Sunak. Before that, how I was treating Liz Truss and Boris. I mean, that comes with the territory. I think, but the point is, with the greatest respect to the people ringing in, I'm not sure they're all ringing in, just on their own bat. I mean, this is basically Reform's coordinated response to this, and it's telling because Reform and Nigel Farage are simply not answering the questions on this. This is why what I mean by this issue just not going away. It's not going away because Nigel Farage, other senior members of Reform, simply cannot give basic, straightforward, credible responses to the question that the media across the board, as you said, we work for different organisations, all media organisations, wherever they sort of sit in sort of the broader political spectrum, have been asking questions now for weeks and months on this, and the reality is we're not getting any answers. So until Nigel Farage can come up with some credible answers, those questions will continue to be asked, regardless of how upset he and his supporters get about those questions.
Now, Dan, you're a sort of fiercely objective political commentator and watcher. What do you make of Andy Burnham's start and the bounce?
Very good. I mean, very positive start, but it's only been 2 weeks. I think part of the bounce is due to the fact that I think Andy Burnham has successfully managed to present himself as someone who looks fresh, who looks different, does not fit the classic prime ministerial mode, and I think that's benefiting him. I also have to say I think he's also benefited. A big part of the Burnham bounce is actually a Starmer bounce. And, just reflecting a relief from people across the political spectrum that Keir Starmer has gone. But the big question is, and political reality is, none of the fundamental issues that Keir Starmer was struggling to surmount in political terms have simply gone away because Andy Burnham comes in. So the question will be over the weeks and months ahead, can he move beyond the very effective and very slick presentation to coming up with some serious concrete answers to all the problems we're facing? And at the moment on that, the jury is still out. Okay, well, look, Dan, great to speak with you. Thanks very much for your time. That's Dan Hodges, who is a columnist, broadcaster, columnist at the Daily Mail. Right.